Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Minoans in our continuing study of the history of civilization. If we look at the island of Crete and the landmass to the north of it, notice up on the upper left we have the Greek peninsula, and then to the right we have Anatolia, what we call modern-day Turkey, and then separating the two almost as though they've been split apart, leaving a lot of crumbles, these islands that are in the middle. And the southern part of that is this long, narrow island of Crete. That's where we're going to have this Minoan civilization, the very first island civilization. Now, you had other people on islands, but this is the first time you've got a high degree of civilization contained to one island. The island of Crete itself is about 160 miles in length, very long and narrow, and the southern part of the island tends to be very rocky. All of the best harbors are in the north side of the island, which means it's going to face to the north. It's going to face those islands of the Aegean, from which you can almost go from Greece all the way to Anatolia and never lose sight of land, because you can just sort of island hop along your way. We owe most of what we know of the Minoans to Sir Arthur Evans. He began excavations in Crete in the year 1900. He excavated the ruins at Knossos, and he was the one who labeled the culture Minoan. They didn't call themselves Minoan. We call them that. And he did that after the legendary King Minos. If you remember the legend was that there was this beast on the island of Crete that was kept by King Minos, and it was called the Minotaur, sort of the head of a bull and the body of a man, and they would sacrifice young people, both young men and young women, to the beast, and he was kept in this labyrinth with all sorts of mazes in it. And then the hero Theseus comes, and he's the one who slays the Minotaur and delivers these young people and brings them back to Athens, and everybody's happy. When we look at the periods of Minoan history, we begin with the early period, what we could call the pre-palatial period, because we're going to see a number of palaces that they're going to be in the high point. So this is before the palaces. We have small settlements early in its history, going from 3600 all the way to 2000 BC, and then starting around 2000 BC, we have the rising period, where we call that the Old Palace period, and the palaces began to be built. And it's around this time that that the legends of Theseus point to this era. Very early in Greek history. And then we come to the high period from 1700 to about 1450 BC, and notice these numbers are all rounded off. And that's the era of what we call the thalassocracy. Now that's a funny Greek word, from the Greek word thalas, which means sea. And so, like we have a democracy and we have a hierarchy and things like that, a thalassocracy is the rule over the sea. And what we're going to see is that the Minoans develop a sea, we could almost call it a sea empire, where they are ruling and they are sending ships around and ridding the area of piracy, because anytime you start naval trade, you're going to have pirates that are going to come and try to take what you have, and so that presupposes they're going to have to sort of push the pirates aside. And this is the palatial period, when the big palaces are going to be constructed. But then this is followed by the late period, 1450 to around 1200 BC. And this is going to be the period of Mycenaean dominance. And we haven't talked about who the Mycenaeans are, so we'll be talking about that more next time. And we're going to see the actual destruction of the Minoan civilization. So it's going to have its rise, it's going to have its heyday, and then it's going to have its fall. And the rising period is going to start around 2000, and the fall is going to culminate in 1200 BC. Now, when we look at the palaces that were found, and of course they're in ruins. After all, you'd be in ruins if you were 3,000 plus years old. They're simply amazing. notice the pillars, the wooden pillars. Now this reminds us of Egypt, where they had pillars too. But in Egypt, we saw that the pillars quickly moved to stone instead of wood. And stone pillars are going to be used here as well. Notice on the right. Notice on the right, sort of the double-headed axe, which is going to be one of the landmarks of the Minoans. Here's an artist's reconstruction of one of these palaces. Extensive palace network. This is where Sir Arthur Evans looked at that and he saw all these rooms, and it reminded him of the story of the labyrinth. And so, because it looked like, sort of a maze, trying to walk your way around that labyrinth, and so he named it after the Minoans. The palace had actually running water that was designed to, springs would flow down and bring water into the palace. Quite an engineering feat for its day. Another thing that we see within the Minoan palaces is this picture of bulls. Again, that reminds us of the Minotaur, but this isn't the head of a bull and a body of a lion. These acrobats would engage in what we call bull leaping, where they would perform acrobatic stunts. Now, I don't know if the bull was wild or tame. We can't really tell from that. But we have not only this picture, but a number of coins and things like that show the same motif. It seems to be a delightful culture. Picture of little Minoan boys boxing. Very involved in the arts, very colorful. Here's a Minoan chariot. Notice that it doesn't look like they're really going to war, just going out for a ride perhaps, and yet they're able to do warfare. Notice the chariot wheel, not 6 spokes but 4 spokes. And we have some early writing. The writing during this period, we referred to as Linear A, still has never yet been deciphered. It hasn't been translated. We simply don't know what it says. There's a later writing, we've called it Linear B. You're not very imaginative in our titles. And this comes from Mycenae. And this has been translated. It has a similar alphabet to Linear A. And yet it's really a pre-Greek. It was deciphered in the 1950s, and it's a very, very early form of Greek. As we said, this is a thalassocracy. The Minoans are going to be rulers of the Mediterranean. And going out from Crete, they're going to have colonies, and we're going to have Minoan influence from one end of the Mediterranean, from Cyprus and from the shores of Canaan, where eventually a colony is going to be known as the Phalus, or what we call the Philistines. To the other end of the Mediterranean, far over in the west, we'll have North Africa, and we'll have colonies in Spain, in Sardinia, in other locations all around the Mediterranean, where this culture spreads and leaves its pottery and its influence. Some have suggested that there might even be evidence for the Minoans out in the Atlantic in the British Isles. Now there's an island about 70 miles to the north of Crete, known as, its ancient name was Thera. Today this island is known as Santorini. And here, let's look at slightly shift our camera. Out in the middle of the island, notice another island is formed just in the last 100 years. This island out in the middle is volcanic because the entire island itself is volcanic, rising very steep. In fact, there's the town of Santorini is located on this sheer bluff, 1,000 feet up. And looking at that island from an aerial view, you can you notice this sort of a ring. Originally, that island was solid. It was one big giant island, and it was a volcanic island that actually blew up. giving one of the most extensive and violent volcanic explosions in human history. Plato tells a story about an island that sounds very much like Thera. He refers to it as Atlantis, and he says, talks about this island of unwalled cities and great ships and that did trade. Of course, he puts it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but he's getting a story from the Egyptians, who weren't really very good at traveling outside of Egypt. Especially, remember when we talked about Egypt, when they went sailing, they'd either go up the Nile or down the Nile. They'd raise their sails or just go with the current. And so they weren't much especially very early, about sailing all around the Mediterranean. And so you can see where maybe if they were telling the story, this island of Atlantis is very far away. But he goes on to say, afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. And a great many scholars, and I'm not a scholar, but I consider I have the same opinion, a great many scholars think that the story of Atlantis was really the story of Thera/Santorini, that sank into the sea, and when the island exploded, it perhaps created tidal waves that might have been 100 feet high, that devastated the mainlands. What did that do to the Minoan civilization? As much damage as that might have caused, most scholars think nowadays that they rebuilt afterwards, and it was a group later on. What nature couldn't do in destroying, yes, it was damage done, but what nature couldn't do, mankind did, as human migrations came around the 1200s and destroyed the civilization. What was that human invasion? Where did that come from? And we're going to talk about that next time when we look at the Mycenaeans.